Okay, so I just wanted to do some analysis of the rules reveals that we're seeing for Age of Sigmar 4th edition. We've got a fair few reveals now. We're getting into the faction focuses, and I think that means we've seen sort of all the key changes to the edition. We don't have every single detail, but we're in a good position to sort of get a good feel for how these things are going to operate. So today we're going to have a look at the command abilities article, and we don't have to read every single bit, but there's a lot of things to have a look at here. A lot of these commands are going to be really big changes to the new edition. So first thing is when we get command points. So this is the amount that we get, and they're describing this as a sort of uh, stricter, more restrained economy of command points. They think we're not going to have as many command points. And I'm not sure that's true based on what we see here. So any ability with command points costs is a command. Each player gains 4 command points at the start of each battle round. The underdog gains 1 extra command point. Each unit can only use 1 command each phase. Each command can only be used 1 time by each army in each phase. You must pay the command point to use the command. Okay, so there's a couple little changes. Mostly, you don't need a unit champion to issue commands. I always thought that this was a weird inclusion in the previous edition. A lot of the units in general look like they don't have much purpose. Like the foot hero units, a lot of them, their purpose appears to be fairly survivable. Like if you look at a Chaos Lord on foot, they have sort of mediocre weapons and they've got a retinue ability, so they're surprisingly difficult to kill. So all they do is exist and are hard to kill. That doesn't really make sense as a unit in the game. And you could say, well, Games Workshop is just terrible at designing rules. And maybe you're right. But also, I suspect that maybe at some point in the design process, you needed heroes to issue commands. And even when I was reading the rules for 3rd edition when they were coming out, and they said, your general can issue commands in 18 inches, heroes can issue commands in 12 inches, totems can also issue commands in 18 inches. Oh, and by the way, unit champions can issue commands to their own unit. And that last little rule makes basically all of the other rules obsolete unless you're playing a really, really weird army. Like there are some armies like ogres, I think, that have problems with they have really elite units that just don't have the elite keyword, or I think maybe Caradron Overlords, where they have like big boats, and again, for some reason, the boats don't have the elite keyword, so they just rely on heroes to give them commands, which can be a bit awkward. For me, like I play Soulblight Gravelords, and zombies don't have a champion, but the direwolves do. The like zombie dogs do have a unit champion, and it seemed really inconsistent about whether you had a unit champion or not. It didn't seem like it was a considered decision to do with whether this unit should be able to issue itself commands, and mostly just like, did we make a model for the unit champion? Is this kind of thematically the kind of unit that might have like an alpha or a commander in the squad? And basically, all of them do. So that decision sort of made commands usable by almost everyone, and I think robbed the game of some of the intended design of the command system. Like it made sense. They had all this infrastructure about issuing commands and receiving commands, and the issuing and receiving rules are kind of unnecessary if the unit issuing it is the unit receiving it. If it's just the unit champion issuing a command to his own unit. And most of the time, when you're playing 3rd edition, you don't say, oh, I'm going to get this character to issue this command to this character. You don't have to think about who is issuing commands and who is receiving them. There's no like, oh, I need a hero to issue the command, and this hero can only issue 1 command a turn, and he's looking over, he's sort of in command of 2 nearby units, so I have to pick which unit. No, they're just the units give themselves the command, and the hero stands around doing nothing, which is especially obvious when they're a hero like the aforementioned Chaos Lord that doesn't really have anything else to do. He's just survivable. So I think, yeah, they really shot themselves in the foot by including that rule. And it was really confusing to me. You could sort of see that all that issuing and receiving, all that other stuff was set up for a game where you needed heroes to issue commands. And even the idea of commands makes a lot more sense when they're being issued by actual commanders. So that's a, I guess we're moving away from that. They weren't even keen to embrace it for third edition, and they thought, screw it, we're not even going to bother. There's a whole bunch of housekeeping and a whole bunch of rules, infrastructure about all that issuing and receiving. We can just get rid of all that. Basically, just everyone has a unit champion. It's fine. And I think this is fine. It makes the game quicker. Takes away from, I guess, some of the complexity, some of the skill expression, and some of the interesting flavor around having commanders that command your army. But I suppose if you really want to do that, you can go play Cities of Sigmar, because their faction focus, or their battle traits, I should say, rely on having actual heroes issue orders, which is a bit confusing, but that'll work that way if you want that sort of play experience. That's available. You just have to play a specific army to get that play experience, which I think is a good sort of solution. Anyway, on the economy of commands, right, you get 4 at the start of the battle round, right? So 4, if you're the underdog, you get 1 more, and we can't see it in this article, or actually, can we see it? No, I feel like I just have to check another article. It's in the army composition article. You get an extra 1 for having fewer auxiliaries. But I don't think this makes you the underdog. I think what makes you the underdog is if you have fewer victory points. So it's actually kind of weird that it's not included in the commands rule section. Maybe this is just the reveals order. Like, we might have seen commands before army composition, I'm not sure. But you get another command point if your opponent has more auxiliaries than you. I don't think this auxiliary thing will come up. I'm not going to count this because it seems sort of like you can fit everything in regiments pretty easily. Even like, just quickly, each regiment you can put 3 units and you have 1 hero. In the general's regiment, you can have 4 units. So like this list here, this has 2 heroes and 7 units potentially, and then also 3 more units. That's a lot of units, especially considering like points values are going up. You're going to have fewer models in your army. So it's really hard to see why this is happening. The only reason I can see that this kind of thing would actually exist is if there are restrictions that are pretty harsh about what kind of units you can take with what kind of heroes. And that might mean that some units that are really, really good in your book, just you have to take a hero that's really expensive and you can't afford to include that hero in your army or something like that. And so for whatever reason, like, you have a bunch of auxiliary units. That looks to me like bad design. I feel like this is the intention of having this penalty is to stop you from doing it. You're really not supposed to take any auxiliary units at all. You should just take units that are in regiments so that you can deploy quickly and your opponent can deploy quickly and you can get on with the game and it's faster. But they don't want to just ban you from doing that. So instead they put in like a fairly high cost for you doing that. So you really want to avoid this, and I think you will be able to avoid it. But there's just this potential that Games Workshop, I guess, makes rules across purposes. Some of their designers think that this is how the game is designed, that you're just not meant to have auxiliary units, and other ones think, oh, it's going to be fun having auxiliary units because we've locked all of the good units to really stupid heroes, or vice versa. So you're going to end up with just a lot of extra spare junk in your list, and it's going to be fun seeing who gets the free command point. I think that's a really stupid way to view it, but Games Workshop has done things like this in the past. So anyway, I don't think that command point is going to be really it's going to come up all that much. I don't think either side is going to have any auxiliaries, but that's something to be seen. Anyway, so you have 4 command points, and one person, pretty much always one person, is going to get this underdog command point. It's very rare that you'll have exactly the same points. So I reckon, one person will have that extra command point, which means if you're going in the past, if you're going first in the battle round, you'll get 1 command point from that, and then you'll get 1 command point for your general, and then in your opponent's turn, you'll get 1 command point for your general being on the battlefield, and then if you use the heroic action in both turns to get an extra command point, then you would have like one more. You roll a 4 up twice, you fail one and succeed one. So you have like 4 in the battle round, which is sort of the same now. You have 4 command points at the start of the battle round. And if you're the underdog, you get one more. But in the old system, if you went second, you got one more. So the economy looks very similar on sort of the number of points that you're getting, unless you're one of those armies that, like Seraphon, who got a bunch of free command points. It looks like they've taken out a lot of the abilities that give you free command points. I think the reason the economy is going to feel differently is because the commands are going to be used differently. And there's some benefits and losses there. We already know they got rid of bravery, so we're not going to use inspiring presence. A lot of the time, you actually have one fewer command than it looks like because you're always sort of saving one for inspiring presence. You don't have to save one for inspiring presence anymore, but you'll be using your commands on other things, so it might feel like you have a lot fewer commands than you used to as well. As far as a catch-up mechanic, I don't mind one command. I think the underdog you get more bonuses in the battle plans. I'm a bit less sure about, but one command here I think is a neat little bonus if you're coming second that doesn't swing the game too much. You never want to drop behind in points to get that extra command. So I think that's a fine buff. Although in general, I don't like underdog mechanics in a game like Warhammer. Yeah, command's not doing too much to ruin anything. This abilities thing, I really like that we've got a nice step-by-step about how abilities work. Makes things a lot clearer. I will highlight something about this, the formatting. They're using colors and symbols as like layers of making things more identifiable. So red, we're told, is the combat phase, and this symbol tells us that this is an aggressive ability. The problem is, all out attack is not a combat phase ability. It's a reaction. Like this bit of text up here tells you when you can do it. Reaction, you declared an attack ability, or you can declare attack abilities in the shooting phase as well. Right? If you're going to shoot is an attack ability. So this shouldn't be just red. It should be like red and blue maybe. And also, if we look at green here, green, as far as we can tell, is not associated with any phase. Like I'll show you, I think it's in Anatomy of a War Scroll. Yeah, this thing, right? The different phases have different colors. There's no green phase. So what does the green on all that defense mean? Now, I think these things don't have any rules meaning. The colors don't have any rules meaning. They're just to try and like give you a feel for, you can quickly glance at a War Scroll and see like which are the special abilities, which are the ones that have something to do with like attacking, and which are the ones that have like a bit more of a defensive thing and whatever. But the whole purpose of having colors like this and having symbols like this is to provide clarity. It's to make it easier to understand. And I'm seeing a lot of people reacting to these rules reveals by being more confused by the colors. So a lot of people I've seen think you can't use all out attack in the shooting phase because it has this red sort of banner up here. And red means combat phase. So you can't use it in the shooting phase because it's got the red banner. But if you look at other abilities, there are some other reveals elsewhere. But like the fight ability, and there's a Norhole one as well. There are other abilities that don't make any sense for being in the combat phase, or that do make sense in the for being in the combat phase that have a different declaration thing. So, for example, the fight ability doesn't say. It says like your combat phase or any combat phase. Sorry, fight says any combat phase, whereas this doesn't tell you the combat phase. Right? So fight tells you that has to be in the combat phase as well as being red. This thing tells you you declared an attack ability and happens to be red. And if you look at the Norhole rule, which I think is in, well, no, it's in the Skaven reveal. If we just have a quick look at Norholes, it's probably on other things, but Norholes are a good example. They have this passive, and again, it's red. It's an offensive ability, apparently. And it says models can pass through this terrain feature, but cannot be set up or end moves on any part of this terrain feature. Well, how does that make sense as a combat phase only ability? Like, are you allowed to move onto it in the movement phase and then charge onto it in the charge phase? But then once you get to the combat phase, you're not allowed to pile in onto it? That doesn't make any sense. This is just something that happens the whole time. And apparently the red here is just sort of telling you that it's an ability that like does damage or something, or is offensive or something like that. The color coding seems to be serving multiple purposes, not just telling you about the phases, which I think is a bit of an own goal. Should be something that clarifies the ability, makes it easier to understand what is happening. And what I'm seeing is it's actually confusing people instead. That might be mostly Warhammer community's fault for the way they've revealed rules. But you know, like maybe this is just a graphic they've made for Warhammer community or something like that. But nevertheless, people seem to be confused about it. Anyway, all that to say, all that attack is the same as before. You can use it on shooting abilities. My understanding is you can only use one command per unit. Right, said that up here. Each unit can only use one command in each phase, so you can't do things like cover fire, which we'll see in a second, and all that attack on your covering fire. This is the same as before. You couldn't use Unleash Hell and use all that attack, although part of the reason you couldn't also use all that attack was because the phase restriction. We don't have phase restrictions anymore. It's just this restriction up here tells you exactly when you can use it, and you declared an attack ability is really handy. So it doesn't matter whether your attack ability happens in the hero phase or the shooting phase or the combat phase or the charge phase, or if you've got some weird ability that lets you fight in some other phase, you can still use all that attack in that phase as long as you're not using another command in that phase. So I think that's really neat. I always got tripped up by that. A lot of people got tripped up by that, and it's just sort of a good thing to get rid of that weird phase restriction. I guess there are still like some of them. I'm praising all that attack because it's based on you declaring an attack ability, but like the fight ability, fight says you declare it in a combat phase. But I suppose abilities that let you fight are going to say, well, you can fight even though it's not. But yeah, you might still run into some of that, but hopefully less of it. All that defense is still +1 to save rolls. This is a big deal. We're yet to see a rampage or like a monstrous action that prevents you. Like we're yet to see raw. We actually don't have many things that in the universal rules. There might be specific war scrolls, but there's not many things in the universal rules that stop you from using commands. So I'm guessing this is going to be quite powerful still, and you're going to be wanting using this fairly frequently. But sort of no change there. At the double and forward to victory, as far as I can tell, this has not been changed. You just sort of run 6 instead, or add 6 to the move characteristic. Forward to victory is the same as before. There was a bit of confusion when this came out, but this works exactly the same as before. Just you can reroll the charge roll. Rally is very different. So rally being that you roll a set number of dice instead of based on the sort of number of missing models in the unit is a really big change. It means it's much more useful for things like heroes, like the fact that you can use this on heroes. It's sort of been merged with heroic recovery. You can use it on like artillery and monsters and whatever, these big wound units that only have one model. So rally's more universally useful. And it's also, less scaling. It doesn't depend on the number of models that are missing in your unit. So using rally on just high value units, regardless of their size, is where you're going to want to position the rally. So if you have like 3 annihilators and 2 of them are dead, well, rallying that unit of annihilators is really beneficial because annihilators are really expensive points wise. Points per wound. You still want to do that arithmetic in your head. Points per wound. You want to target the highest point per wound models in your army to rally because those, you're getting up to, on average, you're getting 3 wounds back. So if you're getting the highest points per wound, you're getting the most points back by using rally. And a lot of the time, that is going to be rallying things like heroes or rallying really elite units. And thankfully, rally works quite well for healing them as well as for returning models to lower wound units. So I'm really happy with this change. I'm not sure I really wanted rally in the game. Um, I play Soulblight Gravelords a little bit, and it's sort of confusing seeing other armies returning as many or even more models than the army that I picked specifically for its ability to replace and return models and summon more models onto the battlefield. Surprisingly, like Soulblight Gravelords actually doesn't have summoning; it just returns models. And yeah, a lot of other people seem to be doing that better. Even we've seen some other rules reveals like Gloomspite have a way of returning models. I think Skaven have a way of returning models. The Norholes thing. Um, yeah, we're seeing a lot more of that. It'll be interesting to see the Soulblight reveals for it as well. But certainly things like Rally, having universal healing in the game, um, sort of intrude on that design space a little bit. I do like that it's linear, so that you can change. Like if you're thinking about abilities that interact with Rally, you can change the number of Rally rolls. So instead of making 6, you could make 8 or 10 or something like that. You can change whether you rally on a 4-up or a 3-up. You can make it automatic, right? And then you're just healing 6 from your rally, right? That could be a way, like if you were in Soulblight Gravelords, they could have an ability that's like all of your summonable units rally on a 1+, right? So they just automatically rally when they make their dice rolls, and so you just get a flat 6 back when you use the rally command or something like that. So there's lots of different ways you could change the healing points or the number that you return or the cost of the returning thing. There's lots of little ways that you can change this ability, and it's hard to make it go wacko insane because of the sort of flat limitation. You're only healing that flat 6 dice at the beginning. You have to like put in a lot of work to make it really oppressive as an ability. So big good changes there, and you'll use it a lot. I think you used heroic recovery a fair bit before. You'll use this a lot too. So that's where one of the command points sinks is going to go. Some rally, redeploy is another one. Before you had this Ristic studies problem, where you would move a unit and then wait for your opponent to redeploy, and often there's a bit of mind games with it. You move it and you say, "Do you want to redeploy?" You move another unit, you go, "You might want to redeploy." You move another unit, not going to redeploy off that. Okay, and then you move the unit that you don't want them to redeploy against, and you don't say anything. Yeah, there was a bit of annoying back and forth throughout the whole phase where you wanted to give your opponent enough time so that they could redeploy. And also, you don't want to have this awkward situation where you move the unit and then you move another unit. So now your opponent has the information of seeing both units, but you've done it quickly enough that they go, "Oh, hold on. I want to do the redeploy from the first thing." Because you're kind of a dick if you go quick and you don't let them interrupt. You don't give them enough time to interrupt and uh, have their chance to redeploy. But also, now they've got a bit of information that they didn't have, and especially if you can tell they're using that information in their decision, but it's hard to like. It's just a really awkward interaction to have this sort of thing, and it happens constantly throughout the game. Um, so I think that, as well as movement phase, is a lot of the time something where people can walk away from the table for a second without interrupting the game too much. In previous tournaments before third edition, people would be like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to go grab a drink. Do you want something?" Or "I'm going to go to the toilet," or something like that. It's good to have a little bit of time where players can walk away from the game because it's a long game. And yeah, if you need to redeploy in between each movement step, then it's very hard to leave the table at all. Whereas now, because redeploy happens at the end of the enemy movement phase after they've moved everything, you can just sort of leave and come back, and then you can do your redeploy after you see all their moves at once. It's a lot clearer on the timing. You don't have that Ristic Studies problem. You don't have to worry about being within 9. I think is a big thing as well. Before, you were really restricted about what you could redeploy. Now you want to think of redeploy as like, I just get D6 movement in my opponent's turn for any of my units, any one of them. And so I can't see a turn where you don't use redeploy. I know it was really popular before, like you would want to redeploy a lot, but now it's just D6 movement on anything. Uh, very, very valuable. You'll probably use it every single turn. I don't see why you would avoid using redeploy. There's got to be something that you want to get D6 more movement on, and you'll be spending this point fairly frequently. So both of these commands are part of the reason I think the command point economy might look a bit tighter, because even though you get a similar number of command points, you're going to want to spend them on rally and redeploy and covering fire and countercharge, right? So speaking of which, covering fire, I think this rule is a mistake. Just flat out, I think this is a big, big mistake. The only way that this rule isn't going to be a big problem is if they nerf or they redesign all the shooting war scrolls to be significantly weaker than they currently are. The moment there is a single good war scroll for shooting in your army, this ability makes that shooting war scroll oppressive and sort of build around and all that sort of stuff, because it just increases the output of that unit a lot. And I've seen some people really defend this rule, saying, well, look, this restriction of you must attack the nearest visible enemy unit, that's a really onerous restriction that really limits the power of this ability. And everyone's played against Idoneth Deepkin and Felt with their shooting units. Well, actually, maybe not everyone's played with a shooting army against Idoneth Deepkin, but that restriction is really punishing. If you've got an army that relies on shooting, being forced to shoot like a unit of either wings, or just some random garbage unit that they don't need or want, or even they can force you to shoot things like the turtle when you don't have mortal wounds, so that it's really hard to actually do any damage. Even saw someone using a Kronspine, right? Kronspine as a way to soak up, I think it was like 2 units of 30 Blissbarb archers or something like this, because you can't actually kill a Kronspine, right? You deal a bunch of damage to it, then at the end of the turn, you roll dice and it goes down a level or something. So it can soak up an entire turn's worth of shooting attacks, which is kind of clever and is really, really punishing for your opponent. This rule is the reason any of this stuff works. But I think people are evaluating it wrong because of that. I think the way you should evaluate covering fire is not by reference to how good the restriction targeting nearest visible enemy unit is, but because that, when you're playing against Idoneth Deepkin, that restriction applies to all of your shooting. That's why it's such a powerful restriction, because you can't shoot anything but the nearest visible enemy unit. But with covering fire, well, when you're playing a shooting army, most of the time you can shoot whatever you want that's in range, and it's only when you're using the bonus covering fire shooting that you have this restriction. So it's definitely the wrong way to think about it in terms of how strong this restriction is. The way you should think about it is in comparison to the restrictions of Unleash Hell, right? My understanding about Unleash Hell is when it was released, it was a 9-inch range, and it didn't require any of the models in your unit to be in a range. They just had to be in shooting range, I think, to shoot at the unit that was incoming. So the activation range being 9 inches was really big. It was very easy to set up a screen and then set up a shooting unit behind it, and you could fully cover that screen, make it impossible to charge them without copying an Unleash Hell. And you could also have a really, really big unit of archers, like you have like 30 sentinels or something, and you couldn't just tag one edge of the sentinels to minimize the shooting they get. The whole unit was able to shoot so long as they had like shooting range, which was quite large. So initially, Unleash Hell was very powerful because you could shoot it any number of your guys and you had 9 inches range, right? That got nerfed. It got nerfed down to 6 inches range for activation, and then subsequently nerfed again so that it was still 6 inches range, but also your models had to be within 6 of the unit as well, right? It's a bit confusing what those changes mean one from the other, but suffice to say there were 2 consecutive nerfs to Unleash Hell because it was too powerful ability, too warping, too unfun, and arguably I don't really see the point of Unleash Hell as a mechanic. I don't get why that exists. It seems to like run contrary to any of the other mechanics of the game. I thought the way that you're meant to deal with shooting units is by engaging them in combat, which I'll mention in a second. But you know, Unleash Hell was really, really powerful, and so powerful that it had to be nerfed. And if you compare this ability to Unleash Hell, this ability is more powerful than the release overpowered Unleash Hell. Right? So that had the condition that you had to charge them, firstly. So Covering Fire doesn't have that condition. You can shoot a unit even before it gets to charge, and it doesn't have to have charged you. So that's one big advantage Covering Fire has over Unleash Hell. The other thing is, Unleash Hell was kind of restricted to shooting the closest unit anyway. I mean, it didn't specify that it actually had to be the closest unit, but because you had to be so close to them and they had to have made a charge move in that turn, you pretty much are guaranteed to be shooting the closest unit possible. Especially since if you're already in combat, you can't Unleash Hell. So if a unit charges you and gets into combat range, that's the unit you have to shoot, and that is the nearest unit to you, or pretty much is anyway, like it's in combat with you. So Unleash Hell kind of already has this nearest visible enemy unit restriction built into it. So Covering Fire is, if you think about it in like strictly better terms, Covering Fire is strictly better than Unleash Hell. It's strictly more powerful. It still has the same subtract 1 from those hit rolls, but it has much more upside. You get much more liberal use out of it. You can shoot before the enemy even gets to charge you. And the counterplay for things like Unleash Hell, yes, you used to have to like charge with 2 units into the 1 unit. Quite difficult to do. But the counterplay for this is, well, it's kind of the same, right? If you want to deal with the shooting unit, you can put a unit that's closer and then a unit that you want to actually charge the shooting unit with. But that means that you have to be successfully charging with the further away unit. That kind of happens with Unleash Hell, but it also happens with Covering Fire. So that like the same counterplay that you had against Unleash Hell is the counterplay that you'll have to use for Covering Fire, except that you also have this problem of getting shot when you're not even in charge range. So yes, you can control which thing is getting shot, but you could do that before anyway. And you could do it before on an ability that did get nerfed twice because it was really oppressive. Now, I've got to say, I played KO when they introduced Unleash Hell, and KO don't have many 6s to hit 2 mortal wounds shooting. And I think they have a lot of 4-up shooting or a lot of 3-up shooting. Depends, the book's changed a fair bit. But there's a sort of mix of 3 and 4-up shooting. Not much of it's 2-up, and I don't think they have many hit bonuses, if any. So Unleash Hell did actually, like the -1 to hit, did penalize Kratadron Overlords a fair bit. And so I can understand, maybe in the new edition, the big difference is there just aren't many units that have crit mortal wounds, right? Or crit extra hits. We're already seeing some that do like crit auto wound. That's probably the least egregious for Covering Fire. But yeah, units that have a lot of crit extra hits or crit, in particular crit mortal wounds, are going to be the things that get around the penalty the most. And it could just be that we don't see those units anymore. We don't get horrifying bow snakes or sentinels or long strikes or any of that sort of stuff, or the cruel boys guys. And it could also be one of the things that makes this a little bit less scary is that you can't double reinforce units anymore. So before you could have 30 sentinels, now you can only have 20 sentinels. And if you have, before you might have had 2 units of 30 sentinels, now you have 3 units of 20 sentinels. You have the same number of sentinels, but it does mean when you use Covering Fire, you're getting 10 fewer sentinels shooting each turn. So there's a few reasons why Covering Fire is not as big a deal. It's not in the rules of Covering Fire though, right? It's in the other changes to the edition, the war scrolls of the shooting units and the reinforcement rules. I think there was one more thing about Covering Fire. Just got to think about it. There's one more thing that I wanted to consider or wanted to point out about Covering Fire. Oh, right. In the new edition, you can't shoot in combat unless you've got shoot in combat. And this expressly says the unit can't be in combat to use covering fire. So even if you have the shooting combat ability, you can't use covering fire to shoot in combat. And now just tagging a shooting unit in general means that it can't shoot at you. And that's a huge, huge, huge change to how scary shooting units are in Age of Sigmar in general. There are lots of really, like, wardens are a really good example, or bow snakes are a really good example. These things very, very scary because even when you engage them in combat, they can be quite durable. Or, you know, with wardens, there can be a lot of them and they can be in their shining company, so they get -1 to be hit. It can actually be hard to deal a lot of damage to them. So restricting them from shooting in combat is actually a really big nerf to shooting in general. And so this, it doesn't interact directly with covering fire, but it does mean shooting units will be less oppressive. And so covering fire might be sort of making up for that. There's one more thing. I'm not sure that we know this about the edition yet. It'll depend on whether you can shoot into combat as well. So if you're in combat, you can't shoot. We know that. But you might still be able to shoot at units that are in combat. And if you can do that, that undermines the first restriction a fair bit. A lot of shooting armies have multiple shooting units. Like I said, you know, if you're running 2 blocks of 30 sentinels, now you'll be running 3 blocks of 20 sentinels. If you engage one of those units of sentinels in combat, what's going to happen is the other units of sentinels are going to shoot the unit that's tying them up, hopefully destroy that unit, and that's going to free up the sentinels that were in combat to shoot and to use covering fire in the enemy shooting phase as well. So really depends on whether that rule exists, and as far as I can tell, we just haven't seen that yet. That makes a big difference to how valuable shooting is, how easy it is to free up your shooting units and to still shoot. Because like you can charge, you can deal with them in melee, you can take those units out and free up your shooting units, but that'll happen after those units had a chance to shoot and missed their chance to shoot because they were in combat. Makes a big difference on the timing. Or even like if we see the rule for not being able to shoot in combat, if it just says if the unit starts the phase in combat, it can't shoot, that would sort of have the same effect. So that'll be really interesting to see. I'm not saying shooting is going to be overpowered. There are lots of reasons to think it won't be, and there are some things that tamp this down a little bit. But overall, this rule, I don't see why you wouldn't use it. It's just free damage. If you had an ability that was like, you can do a free fight and also your unit gets to fight at 18 inches range, but you have to fight at -1 to hit, you would take that ability, you would use it every single time you're in range. There is no reason, even if the only thing you're fighting is some useless nonsense thing, people use Unleash Hell all the time. So long as they had a shooting unit that was worth shooting with, they would use it when they had the chance to use it. And that'll be the same thing here. Covering fire is going to be a workhorse for shooting armies. I'm actually kind of upset seeing it, but maybe it's just compensation for some of those other changes, like not being able to shoot while in combat. So we'll have to see. Oh, there's one more thing I think covering fire, the logic behind it. I said earlier, I don't see why Unleash Hell is mechanic in the game. Like what sort of mechanical fault with Age of Sigmar was there? Why was shooting so weak that you were thinking, oh, we need to give them more chances to shoot? I think one of the problems is the double turn. Playing KO in particular, because you're only shooting your turn, if you double turn against a shooting army, it's really defenseless for a long time. But the flip side is also true. If you double turn as a shooting army, you get 2 shooting phases in a row, and that can be really backbreaking for your opponent. And something like covering fire lets them weaken the shooting war scrolls a fair bit, but still allows you to do a fair bit of shooting damage, even when it's not your turn. And one more specific benefit that something like covering fire can bring from a game design perspective is unit diversity, right? If you have an army that is like 80 sentinels, well, you can still only use covering fire a single time, right? Whereas if you have 1 unit of sentinels, you can use covering fire a single time. So proportionally, you want to have, like, just to get benefit out of this ability existing, you want to have one shooting unit, but overdoing it on all the shooting units, adding more and more and more shooting units, doesn't help your army as much as adding that first shooting unit. And so there's like a tiny little niche where you can make shooting actually fairly weak overall. Like, just if you take a shooting war scroll by itself, it's kind of weak, but the shooting war scroll plus covering fire will make that war scroll as good as any other war scroll. So the first shooting unit you bring to the table, that gets to shoot twice every turn, once in your turn, or twice every battle round, once in your turn, and then once in the opponent's turn at -1 to hit towards the closest target. And when you add those shooting phases together, that shooting unit is as powerful as any melee war scroll. And because of that, they've sort of they've used soft design to limit you to having one shooting unit instead of just saying, well, you can only have one shooting unit. That's what you're restricted to. They just sort of incentivized you. You can have one shooting unit. It's really efficient to have one. Having two or three, investing really heavily in shooting, you get diminishing returns. You can still do it if you want to, but you'll get diminishing returns. So as much as I'm concerned about covering fire, I'm concerned because of the history of Unleash Hell and the way that that went. I'm also sort of hopeful that that is the design philosophy, that somebody in the design studio in Games Workshop is thinking about the mechanics and is like, the reason we have covering fire is so that we can set up this incentive structure, and they have to carry that through when they design war scrolls. And the test will be when we see armies that have one or maybe two shooting units, but don't have an overwhelming amount of points invested in shooting and are just like heavily focused on that, except for armies like KO or whatever, where that's really the whole vibe. So very interesting to see. It can be hard to balance. Like, if you have an army that's like KO versus an army that's meant to take like one shooting unit and use covering fire. We'll see how that goes. I have a feeling it'll fall apart. But very interesting ability nonetheless. And again, you'll be using this like every turn. You'll use this pretty frequently. You'll use this pretty frequently. And you'll use this. If you've got shooting units, you use this pretty frequently. All right. Big article. Countercharge. Countercharge is massive. Sad for the armies that this was their special toy, but I think good in general that this is coming to the whole game, that everyone gets countercharge. This is really dynamic. There are so many little uses for it. The more I think about it, the more interactions it has with other rules mechanics, not just like charge mechanics. If you see things like, we look at the Stormcast rules, they have a war scroll on their Annihilators. I'll just have a quick look at that. So Annihilators, when they charge, not when they charge, when the enemy charges, you can use this ability. Pick an enemy unit that charged this turn and is in combat with this unit to be the target. Roll a dice for each model in this unit. If any of the rolls are a 6, the target has strike last for the rest of the turn. So this ability doesn't specify that the Annihilators unit can't have charged. So what you can do is, your opponent charges your, I don't know, Vigilators or something, charges some other unit of yours. The nearby Annihilators countercharge that unit, and then they can use Brace for Impact and make that unit strike last. So there are some neat interactions. Where have we gone? There are some neat interactions with countercharge for like really tactical combo type gameplay. But there are also just some things that I think sort of easy to miss. Like, at the moment, if you've got a unit left that has like one or two models, you can just like retreat, and your opponent, I guess they can redeploy to reposition a little bit, but they have to waste a lot of time on their turn chasing that unit down and killing it. But now, if you retreat, especially with a slow moving unit, if you move like 5 inches away from your enemy, they can just countercharge the unit that you retreated with. So it's really difficult to just sort of back away from a combat. You'll need another unit to sort of charge in and deal with that unit that's going to cut down your fleeing units. So there's going to be some, once you get your hands on this tool and you really start using it, I think this, more than any other change, is going to be a really, really big difference. At the moment, when I play Soulblight, I've played some games with Legion of Night, and Legion of Night have a counter charge ability. Their one is a bit more restrictive. Like you have to be within 12 of an enemy unit that charged, and you have to make that charge straight away. And there's some logistical frustrations where like you set up a screen and you're behind the screen, they charge your screen, and then you have to like charge around your guys. That's pretty awkward to do. Uh, but there are some things like the 3-inch melee range that make that not as big of an issue now. You might be able to charge so you can get one guy in combat, and then the rest of your guys might just have range to attack over the screen. Or maybe once you charge around and pile, you've got such long melee range that you'll actually be able to get your counter-charging unit in range to fight. So yeah, I think there are a lot of other changes happening in the game that make counter-charge a really valuable and really interesting rule. I guess the fact that shooting units can't shoot in melee is another one. Just being able to countercharge something that maybe you deep strike on your turn and you roll a 9-inch charge and you fail it, but on their turn the shooting unit is still close to that unit that you deep striked. You can just try and charge again, and once you tag them in combat, they can't shoot anymore. Right? That's a big deal. So just being able to sneak in charges, especially if you've got units that have flying and things like this, or units that have bonuses to charge, like we see Andrasta is flying, she's a small model, and she has 3d6 to charge. Like Andrasta is going to get into some really sneaky spots, and she can do it at a really sneaky time as well. So I think things like counter charge, I think this is going to be revolutionary for the game. I'm really excited to use counter charge. Most of my armies are like all melee armies, and it's a huge utility tool for them. So very excited to use counter charge. You're going to be using it all the time. 2 command points for it. Again, this is the kind of thing that's making the command point economy feel tight. It's not that you don't have many command points, it's that the competition for using these commands is really tight. If you, in your turn, you get 4 points, you can use rally twice, you can use redeploy twice, you can use covering fire. Wait, you can use redeploy once and covering fire once. Sorry. You can only use these enemy turn. And you can use counter charge, which is 2 points. That's 6 points. Like that's more than what you get, right? And there's more commands to go. Right, we've got magical intervention. This thing is massive. I was really upset when I saw some of the magic rules, like we're still casting on 2d6. We've still got the unbind. I find the unbind minigame like deeply unsatisfying. A bit like with the movement thing, where you're sort of trying to bait your opponent's redeploy by moving all your garbage stuff, and then finally moving the thing that you don't want them to redeploy against. And after you've gone through all this like back and forth, the same, like they end up just doing the redeploy anyway. Same thing happens with casting and unbinding. You want to cast all your junk spells to like bait out your opponent's unbinds, and then you'll have free shot with your really impactful spell. But also there's this bias against unbind. Like if I have 3 spells to cast and they have 3 unbinds, and the first spell I cast, I just fail the casting value, means that they still have 3 unbinds and 2 casts, and they don't have to worry at all about whether or not they're going to have enough unbinds, or even if they only had 2 unbinds, sorry, and I had 3 casts. There's this sort of problem of just unbinding being in a bit too advantageous a position for information compared to casting. So I think, yeah, I was sad to see that, but then really, really happy to see magical intervention. Magical intervention changes magic a lot. It'll change priest a little bit as well, especially because priests build up points now. So you can build up points in both turns. You're building up twice as fast, which is a big deal if you've got those high value prayers that go off on a 10 or a 12 or something that they seem to be doing. But yeah, being able to cast in the enemy phase is particularly interesting because you share unbinds and casts. So a wizard that is power level 2 can cast 2 spells, or unbind 2 spells, or cast a spell and unbind a spell. It's a big deal if you only have this level 2 wizard and your opponent has a level 2 wizard. If you want to cast 2 spells, that means you don't have any more unbinds open for your opponent when they use magical intervention and they cast a spell at the end of your hero phase. and they get to see what casts you have left, or unbinds you have left, before they spend the command point on magical intervention. So it messes around with the math of when you want to use casting, and I think it'll create lots of windows to cast spells that your opponent doesn't try to unbind. Because a lot of the time, the unbinding roll is much harder to beat than the casting value. Casting value is usually 5 or 6 on a spell. The unbinding roll averages a 7, but because they need to beat you, really it's like a casting value of 6. It's equivalent to having a casting value of 6. But often it's higher, right? Because they've got that backup. It's like they can take the 6 as a casting value, or they can take the casting value. So what I should say is they can take the roll, or they can take the casting value as their unbinding roll. And usually the unbinding roll is higher. So in general, spells are very difficult to cast if your opponent has an unbind. It's like a coin flip type of probability. And you're going to get the opportunity to cast spells without them being unbound a lot more frequently. And I think that's probably a good change. I think in general, Magic should move towards a playstyle and an expectation that you will get your spells off. Spells should be appropriately powerful, considering that most of the time they will cast properly, unless they have a really high casting value. Like if you have a spell that has a casting value 10 or 11 or whatever, that can be a more powerful spell. But at the moment, we really don't see that. Spells have like casting values 5, 6, maybe 7, maybe 8 on very, very few spells. But most of the time, the casting value doesn't matter because the unbind roll is higher than the casting value most of the time, or half the time anyway. So the big thing that you're worried about is just the unbind roll, and that's just a random 2d6. So I'm really happy about this. There's also a ton of tactical depth about being able to cast something in your opponent's turn. There are lots of debuff spells. I play, like I said, Soulblight Gravelords. There are lots of things that doing it at the last possible chance, or getting just a second go at doing it, can be really, really important. I think we've seen Mystic Shield. Mystic Shield looks really bad, but there are lots of buffs that I find either like my opponent is too close to me, they're either too far away, I'm out of range, I can't use them, or they're like already up in my face and I've missed my chance to use them. Things that debuff their attack abilities, or things that damage them when they charge, like Soul Pike. And this just gives you like another chance to use them in that sweet spot while they're in range, while they're, close enough to you. And you can sort of spend the command point to get the extra uses and not invest anything when you don't need those extra uses. So I'm really excited about Magical Intervention. I think it'll be really good, especially for armies that want that interactive casting spells on your enemy's units. Typically spells that have been worse in the past, because the spells that buff your guys are always in range. Whereas this Magical Intervention sort of helps, has that variable load, right? You can pay the command point when the enemy's in range. You don't have to worry about spending the command point if they're not in range. So very excited to play with this, and we'll see it a lot. So again, you're using all these commands. There's a lot of command points, and as far as we can tell, we're not getting any war scrolls or battle traits that give us a whole bunch more command points. All right. I think this is the last one, Power Through. Power Through is a weird ability, and it's the one where I read it and I thought that is so cool, and then completely forgot how it worked. And you probably did the same thing. You probably read it and then forgot this ability existed. It's going to take a bit of getting used to, especially because it's a bit restricted in when you can use it. So I'll just go through it. Pick a friendly unit that charged this turn. You have to charge to use this ability. Then you must pick an enemy unit in combat with it to be the target. The target must have a lower health characteristic than the unit using this ability. All right, so you pick one target, even if you're in combat with multiple enemies. The effect is inflict D3 mortal damage on the target. Then the unit using this ability can move a distance up to its move characteristic. It can pass through and end that move within the combat ranges of enemy units that it was in combat with at the start of the move, but not those of other enemy units. It does not have to end the move in combat. There's a lot of really weird implications with this. So like if you're in combat with two things, one thing has I don't know, 30 health, one thing has 1 health as a characteristic, you can still use power through, and apparently you can move around that unit, around the other unit as well. It's very interesting sort of uh, edge cases about how the rules are specifically written with power through. Um, Importantly, you don't have to end the move in combat. So for a lot of things like, I guess, Chaos Knights or like Knights in general, you can charge infantry units and you'll generally have a higher health characteristic than them. So just paying attention to like how high your health characteristic versus theirs, you can use, you can charge them and then you can use power through and leave combat. And especially when you consider that retreating now deals D3 mortals to you, this ability flips that. You deal D3 mortals to them and you get the hell out. It's going to be, to me, makes a lot more sense if your unit has a charge bonus like Chaos Knights or Blood Knights or something like this. You want to charge and then you immediately want to power through and just leave, right? Because you can only do this in the turns where you charge. I think, as far as I can tell, you can do this in a turn where you counter charge as well. I can't see any reason why that wouldn't, like, you'd be restricted from doing that. So potentially, you could, on the enemy turn, you could counter charge with your knights or something like this, do some charge damage, fight with your cavalry, power through to get out of combat because you get a full move distance, so high move, high wound units like monsters and cavalry who can make a lot of advantage out of this. So they can move back, and then in your turn you can charge back in. Right? You can do like the double charge or the cycled charging that you can do in games like what's it called, Total War. Right? There's a bit of like really taking advantage of those charge bonuses that you get. So this one's a really weird ability. It's going to take a bit for it to sink in that this can happen because it seems restrictive, but it's also quite universal if you pay attention to the health characteristics and you pay attention to what you're using against what. Sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I don't know, you charge into combat, you deal a bunch of damage, and then you just want to sort of move away. But like that'll leave the enemy unit free to do whatever it wants. And then the enemy's about to have a turn. But also, there's still the possibility of a double turn in the game. So if you're going second in the battle round, using power through can set you up for charging. Then you can power through to move back or move over the enemy unit, right? You charge into a screen and deal a bunch of damage and then move past it. Then you can move and charge again and get a lot of distance. Like you can essentially move, charge, move, and then in the double turn, move and charge again. You can just cover so much ground using something like power through just to give you a bunch of extra movement. I think there's one more thing about this ability that really confuses me. And that is you have to pick a target. So you have to be in combat. So you do have this problem where if you charge the unit and then you wipe it out, then you can't power through. So you incidentally, like if there's an objective that you want to get on and a screen sort of halfway towards it, you could charge into the screen and then power through to get onto the objective. But if you destroy the screen, then you're not allowed to power through anymore. So there's some weird stuff there. I'm not sure I like that. I always frustrated when I'm sort of in a worse position because I killed more of the enemy. But certainly like this is going to catch me off guard like 3 or 4 times because somebody remembered it and I didn't remember it. But once you start using it, I think this will be really, really valuable, mostly because it's an ability that lets you do a full move, right? All the movement abilities, like we saw how powerful redeploy was in this edition. Redeploy got better. This is a full move characteristic, and all that it requires is that you're in combat with something that has a lower health characteristic with you. If you're a unit with, like if you've got monsters in your army, you're going to want to use power through. If you've got like cavalry or anything like that, you want to consider what types of things you want to charge so that you can use power through. All right. They had the Stormstrike Chariot. Have a quick look at this, and that's the end of the article. All right. So when I'm evaluating these War Scrolls, I'm not sure I'm going to spend too much time looking at their specific weapons, because these sorts of things are really hard to evaluate. I don't know how good they are in terms of power level because we don't really know how powerful anything is. So these things are really, really hard to judge. Sometimes it'll matter in terms of like the way they combo with their other abilities, and we'll refer to it there. But mostly, I'm not too fussed. Things like I don't. These guys probably did have movement 10. Everything with like movement more than 10 seems to be losing some. But yeah, something like 10 health, really valuable for power through. And then it's got this any charge phase, right? You can use it in yours, or you can use it the counter charge. Declare if this unit charges phase, pick one enemy unit with one of it to be the target. Roll a d3 on a 2+, inflict an amount of mortal damage equal to the roll. I like this. You don't have to roll to then roll. You just you get 2 or 3 mortal wounds, or you don't bother. And then Celestial Blaze. When this unit uses the power through command, inflict an additional d3 mortal damage on the target and add d6 to the distance this unit can move as part of that ability. All right, so you can do that combo where you can countercharge, and then you'll do d3 mortal wounds, roughly. And then you can power through and do 2d3 more mortal wounds, and you get a movement of 10 plus a d6. So that's pretty cool. Like as far as like a chariot, I think that's thematic gameplay. You want to like charge through the enemy units, dealing a bunch of damage. Most of your damage probably coming from these sorts of things. I imagine you pick one, yeah, you get the spear or the great bow. So you're not doing a ton of damage with these things, although +1, yeah, you do a little bit. But yeah, I think you're gonna get more damage out of these abilities. So you're gonna be using a fair few command points with the Stormstrike Chariot. Um, but in general, I think that really sells the theme and explains. That's a really good pick for explaining this power through and this counter charge and the value that they're going to get out of that. I think I'm getting a bit frazzled. It's a lot longer of a video than I thought it would be. Hopefully that analysis has been useful for you, just thinking about some of these abilities. In particular, I'm interested in if you think Covering Fire is a scary ability, whether it's going to ruin the game or whether maybe it has this potential to have maybe a positive effect on the way shooting units sort of included in the game. I'm not sure I trust Games Workshop to write the rules to make sure the shooting units don't get out of control given this Covering Fire rule. But there certainly is, I think there's a narrow window where actually this Covering Fire could be beneficial, if anything. So let me know what you think, and yeah, I'll leave it there for this one.